So after my conviction on gross starter negligence, I was sentenced to 6 days of solitary confinement with my starter, a bag of flour, and a bucket of water. I was committed to turning things around to try to redeem myself and my starter, and after 6 days, I'm happy to report that it worked. After 6 days, my starter was overflowing from its vessel. It could not be contained. It could not be constrained. It is the strongest starter I've had since I started sourdough baking. In 6 days, it was an amazing turnaround. Now, if I showed all the steps, it would take an hour to do this. I'll probably make a separate video on this topic. But what I'll do here is show you the highlights of what I did each day and show you the key things that I accomplished. It was really quite amazing because I didn't have access to rye flour, I didn't have access to a proofing box. There were no tricks, there were no gimmicks here. All I did was change the starter feeding ratio and the starter feeding interval. That's it. And in 6 days, I completely turned around the starter. I more than doubled the strength of the starter. So on day 1, I started with my existing starter, Callie. This is the starter that I used in episode 5 to make those loaves. This hadn't been fed in 36 hours. Some people ask me where this name Callie came from. I tried to write California on here, but I ran out of space on my tape, so I ended up with Callie. I created this starter about 3 or 4 months ago. I made a video about this where I wanted to create a California starter, so I ordered some flour from California from the Central Milling Company. And it came from Petaluma, California, which I later found out was just a shipping distribution center. And the flour could have come from anywhere, and the company is actually located in Utah. But I didn't want to rename my starter. I couldn't think of anything with Utah in the name other than Johnny Utah, which is kind of a stupid name unless you're Keanu Reeves. So this is still my starter, Callie. So anyway, on day 1, I took this starter and I used this beaker. You'll see this in the video, so we could really measure the percent rise each day. So I decided to start with a 1-2-2 feeding ratio. That's what I normally use. So I started with 30 grams of starter, 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water to give me a total of 150 grams of new starter each day. I mixed that together. I put it in this beaker. I put it in front of a camera with a clock, a thermometer, so we could really measure what was happening. And over the course of that 24-hour period, the starter only rose about 80%. It didn't even double. And it took 11 hours to get to its peak. That's really the definition of a weak starter. I mean, when you think about what makes a strong starter, you want your starter doubling in volume every 4 to 6 hours, depending on the temperature. My temperature was in the low 70s throughout this entire experiment. 73 Fahrenheit was probably the average. That's 22.8 degrees Celsius. So day 1 just proved that my starter was really quite weak. Then on the morning of day 2, I decided to feed my starter every day at 8 a.m. This is important for starter maintenance, is you want to be on a regular feeding schedule and you never want to go more than 24 hours without feeding. This is where I had fallen down on the job, prior. I was going 36 hours without feeding it. Some days I would skip a day and I'd go 48 hours. You really never want your starter to go more than 24 hours without a feeding. That's really the maximum. So on the morning of day 2, 8 a.m., the most important thing you do before feeding your starter is assess how much food did the starter eat the day prior. So I looked in the beaker, and what you see here is that even with that slow rise, 24 hours later, the starter still hadn't consumed all of its food. So you want to use this data point to determine whether you should change your starter feeding ratio. This is how you determine whether to change the starter feeding ratio, is you see, has the starter consumed all the food from the prior day? So because I did a 1-2-2 ratio, it didn't consume all the food. I stick with 1-2-2. There's no benefit to changing that. Some people will say, if your starter is weak, go up to 1-3-3, go up to 1-4-4. You can't force feed a weak starter. So this shows there was still food left. There's no reason to change the starter feeding ratio when you see that happen. So now let's talk about starter feeding ratios, because I know this can be confusing. The most common feeding ratios are 1-1-1, 1-2-2, 1-3-3. Those ratios are basically three numbers. The first number is your quantity of starter that you're carrying over from the prior day. The second number is the amount of flour as a ratio of the starter. The third number is the amount of water as a ratio to the starter. 1, 1, 1 is equal parts. We could have done 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. In a 1, 2, 2, it's 30, 60, 60. You just do the math. So when you think about your starter feeding ratio, the easiest way to think about this is through something I call the camping analogy. So when we feed our starter, we're starting with our existing starter, we're adding flour, we're adding water. I think of this as if you're a camp counselor and you're sending some campers out for an overnight trip, and you have to figure out how much food and drink to send with them. So in a 1-1-1 feeding ratio, I send for each camper 1 meal and 1 bottle of water. In a 1-2-2 feeding ratio, for each camper, I send 2 meals and 2 bottles of water, etc. And then what I do to assess the sufficiency of that feeding ratio is the next morning, when the campers come back, if I send 30 campers out and 30 campers come back the next day and they still haven't eaten all the food that I gave them yesterday, I don't change the starter feeding ratio. If I send 30 campers out with 30 meals and 30 bottles of water and only 20 of them come back, then I know I'm starving my campers, so I need to increase my feeding ratio. So the next day, I'd probably go up to 1, 2, 2. If none of the campers starve to death, then you don't change the feeding ratio. So then the obvious question is, how do you know if your starter is starving? Here's what a starving starter looks like. Totally flat, no bubbles or these tiny pinpoint bubbles, completely liquefied, and this thin layer of alcohol forming on the top. That's the classic case of what a starving starter looks like right there. Now, some people will say, just overfeed your starter. Just go up to 133, 155. You can't force feed your starter. It's impossible. Starter eats flour and starches when food is available, and it doesn't eat it when it's not available. It can't eat faster. Starter is not hungry. Starter doesn't have a stomach. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have fat stores. It eats in the presence of food, and it starves when there's no food. So there's no benefit to overfeeding your starter. So resist the temptation, because you'll just waste a lot of flour. So on the morning of day 2, I assess how much food was left from the prior day. There was still clearly food in the beaker, so I don't change my starter feeding ratio. I feed it 1, 2, 2 again. And then what happens is the starter doubled in 8 hours. So now it's improving. It's increasing in speed and it's increasing in strength. So I'll show this chart with the results of each day so you can see the starter doubling time decreasing. That's what we want to see, is we want to see these blue bars going down each day. That's the time that it takes to double. So on the morning of day 3, it's 8 a.m. We always feed at the same time, but the first thing I always do before feeding is I assess, did my campers starve to death? How much food was left? So now I look in the beaker, and here you can see, unlike day 1, all the food was consumed. And when you see your starter really thin and watery and very few bubbles on top, that means that your starter is running out of its food source. I wouldn't say this is completely starving because you wouldn't see any bubbles on top, but this is definitely lacking food. So now on day 3, we do something very important, change the starter feeding ratio, because my starter is starving. So now that we go up to a 1-3-3 feeding ratio, we have to do some math here, because I still want the total quantity of the fed starter to remain 150 grams. So the way you do this is you take 150 grams divided by the number of parts of your feeding ratio. 1 plus 3 plus 3 is 7. 150 divided by 7 is 21.5. So I'm going to round up to 22 grams of starter, and then I'll use 64 grams of flour, 64 grams of water to keep our total at 150. But note here, and I'll come back to this, we're actually reducing the amount of starter that we're going forward with. We had 30 grams in our formula yesterday. We're going down to 22 grams today. That's going to be important. So I mix up the starter based on the new ratio. We watch what the starter does here. It's increasing in speed again. Now it's doubling in 7 hours versus 8 hours yesterday. But something else interesting is happening here because we didn't just increase in speed from 8 hours to 7 hours, we also increased in strength in another way because I went from 30 grams of starter yesterday as my base to 22 grams of starter today. So I not only increased my starter faster by doubling in volume, but I actually lifted more weight. It's almost like we went from one weightlifting class to another class. In the 1-2-2 ratio, I had 30 grams of starter trying to rise 120 grams of food, so that's 4 times its weight. In the 1-3-3, I have 22 grams of starter trying to lift 128 grams of food, that's 6 times its weight. And it did it in 7 hours versus 8 hours. So it not only rose faster, it lifted more weight. So my starter really strengthened here more than it appears just in that change from 8 hours to 7 hours because I'm using a smaller starter quantity to begin with. Day number 4, we assess our food source again. Now this looks similar to day 3, but this is still slightly thicker. It hasn't totally thinned out and there are more bubbles on top here. This is kind of a judgment call. I'm going to keep this feeding ratio at 1-3-3 because this doesn't look like it's totally starving to me. It doesn't smell like alcohol. It's not completely flat and there's still bubbles on top, but this is close. There's just enough food here, but we're going to keep it at 1-3-3. So we watch our starter on day 4. Now it doubles in height in 6.5 hours. Again, an improvement from the prior day where it doubled in 7 hours. Now we're at 6.5, still making good progress. So it's the morning of day 5. We size up our starter. This again looks pretty flat. It looks like it's almost consuming all the food here. So today we're going to change something else. Instead of changing the feeding ratio, I can also change the feeding interval. So instead of feeding this 1-3-3 every 24 hours, I'm going to feed it 1-3-3 every 12 hours. So I'm just arbitrarily picking that point in time because I know it's going to be post-peak because we're peaking in roughly 6.5 hours. I'm going to cut this off at 12 hours and feed it again. And sometimes you can boost your yeast production by doing a shorter interval because there's a theory that when you feed your starter, the yeast population grows by about 25% as the starter is rising in the vessel. Right when it peaks at the top, the yeast will still grow another roughly 9%, according to some studies that I've seen, after it peaks. So we make sure that our yeast is at peak population up there. I'll pick that 12-hour interval. We'll refeed this and see if we can get a little bit more pickup here by trying to catch the yeast population at its peak rather than letting it decline in that extra 12 hours until you get to the next morning. So our day 5 morning rise at 1-3-3 actually took 6.75 hours. That's roughly equivalent with 6.5 hours from the prior day. So I'm not seeing any improvement here from the 1-3-3 feeding yesterday to the 1-3-3 feeding this morning. So now at 8 p.m., we do a 1-3-3 feeding at the 12-hour interval. So we size up our starter here. You can see there's plenty of food left. So this isn't a question of whether or not the starter is starving. I'm just arbitrarily deciding that I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of food here to try to catch the starter at a higher population before it declines. So we do a 1-3-3 feeding at 8 p.m., let this go overnight. So the second rise on day 5, 6.5 hours. So we're not seeing a big improvement here. Our last 3 readings were 6.5 hours, 6.75 hours, 6.5 hours. So we're seeming to hit a little bit of a plateau here. It's the morning of day 6. This is the last day of our sentence. We're going to size up our starter here this morning. You can see there's still plenty of food left from the 1-3-3 feeding that we did 12 hours ago. We're going to feed this 1-3-3 again. So this is our morning rise on day 6. This is our fastest ever, 5.5 hours to double in volume. This starter is still strengthening. So you'll notice that this improvement came after 2 back-to-back feedings at the 12-hour intervals. If we compare this 5.5 hour doubling time to where we were the morning of day 5, This is almost a 20% improvement, strictly attributable to the change in the feeding interval with no change to the feeding ratio. It's the middle of day 6. I think we're going to call this done. Our 6-day sentence is over. We have more than doubled the strength of the starter. Let's look at the chart. So here's the chart showing the number of hours that it took to double each day. If you recall, on day 1, we started at 11 hours, then we went to 8 hours, 7 hours, 6.5 hours. We kind of plateaued around that 6.5 range. We dropped down to 5.5 hours was our best case on the morning of day 6. So this shows how that doubling time declines as your starter strengthens. Another way to look at this is to look at the number of milliliters that we rose the starter divided by the number of hours that it took. I like this chart as well. So this red line shows the rise in milliliters per hour. So you want this chart to be going up. That's basically showing the speed of your starter. But what happened in this scenario is because we changed from a 1-2-2 feeding to a 1-3-3 feeding on day 3, you can't just look at the speed. You also have to look at what I call the strength factor, because our starting quantity of starter went down on day 3. So that rise on day 3 was actually more than just increasing speed. It was increasing speed and the volume. So now we do another calculation where I take that milliliters per hour and now divide that by the number of grams of starter that we started with. And this is your true strength factor of your starter. The strength factor of your starter is the milliliters of rise divided by the number of hours that it took to double, divided by the number of grams of starter that you started with. This is a true power or strength factor of your starter, and you can see that we peaked on day 6 at 1.06. What that means is 1 gram of starter rose 1 milliliter of volume in 1 hour. That's a really interesting ratio, and I'll do some additional experiments on that, but I think that's a really good comparison to see when you hit really the optimal strength of a starter. So if you look at that strength factor on day 6 where we hit 1.06 compared to where we started with a strength factor of 0.3, that's a 250% increase. This starter improved its strength by 2.5 times. I mean, that is an unbelievable improvement. I'm blown away by this, that in this short of a period of time, I was able to completely transform this starter into like a super powered starter. And it's not just looking at the chart. The starter smells different. It feels different. It's frothy, it's bubbly, it's yeasty, it smells wonderful. I mean, this totally changed the nature of the starter. Because when you do these frequent feedings and you get a really strong starter like this and you keep it well fed, it also de-acidifies the starter. It takes the acid level down. So it favors the yeast, and you get a much more yeasty, stronger starter when you do this. So what's the bottom line? No tricks, no gimmicks. I had a bag of flour, a bucket of water, and my existing starter, and I increased my starter strength by 2.5 times just by focusing on that feeding ratio and the feeding interval. That's the only tools I had available to me. It was an incredible result here. Now, some people will say, this seems like a lot of work. You know, I just used my weak, unfed starter. You can make bread with an unfed starter. It just takes a long time. And I don't want my bread to take forever, because in episode 5, I was making bread at 2:30 in the morning. That's kind of a hassle. So by having a stronger starter, it helps you control your baking schedule. It helps you compress your baking time. And I have a feeling when we bake these loaves with the improved starter from this experiment, the loaves are actually going to look better and they might actually taste better. We'll see.